So to start us off in a great way, we're delighted to call on our morning keynote speaker, Dr. Lorna Williams. You saw her briefly yesterday as she introduced Prince Charles, but today you get to hear from her for reals, because she is such an expert in what she does. She hails from the Lower Statlam territory of Lillooet, which is also known as Mount Currie, so just north of Whistler. She's Professor Emerita from the University of Victoria, where she was the Indigenous Education Director and the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Knowledge and Learning. She's going to bring her story and her wealth of knowledge from documenting and revitalizing Indigenous languages here in British Columbia, Canada, and beyond, as a language speaker, advocate, and academic. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Lorna Williams.
كسوالب نشنوك تطلع مشلقة بالجونة كمخمن توالة. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful that you've come to be a part of this gathering. And I know so many of you in this room. I am so proud to know all of you. And I had a very touching moment yesterday. I was in the lobby ready to leave, and a young man came, well, he's not so young anymore, and asked me if I remembered him. He was my student in 1968, when he was 14 years old. And it was moving and touching because he gave me a book about his culture, his stories. And so many people in this room, you are so inspiring. I know the work that you've done. I've traveled to every community in this province. I've seen what you do. I've heard your stories. I've seen the work that many of you do. Many times, the language warriors you are, you worked alone. I've also seen, though, in some communities, people working together like we always did, that we need to remember more. I had the great, great honor to have been invited by First Peoples and the AFN to travel this country. It must have been 2 or 3 years ago, I can't even remember now. From here in Victoria all the way to Halifax. And my job was to listen. And I listened to what people had to say across the country about what they want, what they need, what they envision, and what they desire for our languages. And so what I'm going to share with you this morning, I thought about it. I thought about what it is we might need, that you might need from me because of my complete and total blessing to have been able to hear what you have to say. I've also worked in many countries around the world. And here in this room, there are people who I've worked with. And one of them, I would like to share their story. Because, there are some things that take place in one's life that cause us to stop, to reflect before moving on. I was blessed to have been invited, and I brought my sister Georgina with me, who is here in this room somewhere, to Cuba, because it's only recently that the indigenous peoples of Cuba have emerged. For 300 years, written in their social studies books, written in their museums, in research papers, it has been said that they were no more, that they were gone, that not one has survived. And yet, they came out of their villages in the mountains, and they invited me to come to witness what they know, what they live, and what they remember of who they are as the indigenous peoples of those islands. I spent a week as each one presented the knowledge that they continue in their medicines, in their foods, in their food preparation, all the ways in which they remember who they are as Taino. And then I was invited last year to be a keynote speaker at their first ever Indigenous Languages Conference, because they not only must emerge to say we are here, they also must piece together and to reawaken their language. And they're doing this in the environment in which they continue to be invisible. They're doing this work the way many, many of you in this room have lived through. So I want you to think about them and to send energizing prayers and energizing thoughts as they do this work. They are but one example of the people around the world who are in this state. And so for you to come together in these 3 days, thanks to the invitation of First Peoples and the First Peoples Cultural Council and Foundation, to come together to help each other. And so I called my talk Nuk'wan'tual, Nuk'wan'tual, which in my language is a plea for you to help one another, in this gathering, but to help one another when you're home, to help one another to remember all of the people who want to learn your language. Kalan, I want you to listen, not just to me, but to listen to one another. There are so many amazing sessions, people who've worked hard to come and to share. I want you to listen. And that is our tradition, to listen deeply, and to learn, and to reflect on what we hear. Ptinusem, I want you to think really, really hard about how you can take what you've learned, what you hear, and to incorporate it into the work that you do. And you know, this is something that I've witnessed in my work all these many, many years. I've watched people, the language warriors of communities across this country and around the world, who've had very little support, very few resources, but because of their creativity, their wisdom, their ability to listen, and they put all that to use. And I want you to look at each other. And I want you to appreciate each other. I want you to appreciate yourselves and what we collectively have been able to do, which is to keep our languages alive. So much effort has been put into silencing us, into shaming us. But, and I see this amongst Indigenous peoples around the world, our ability to laugh, our ability to tell stories, our ability to share, our willingness to help, those are what has kept our languages alive. And so I want you to continue those. So I thought about this morning about what I should focus on. And I decided that I wanted to name some of the challenges that have emerged in our quest to make our languages living. And because we do face some, you know what they are. But I'd also like to tell you some stories about how people have overcome them. I said most of this one. There's a woman, and when I saw this quote, and I'm sorry, but I can't even remember where I saw it, but I thought that she named, Angelina Stump names, in such a beautiful, descriptive way, the work that we're doing. She said, we're trying to put together a mirror shattered in a million pieces. And it doesn't refer only to language. It refers to the very fabric of our lives, our knowledge systems, our cultural practices, our traditions, our languages. And when I thought about this quotation, we're trying to put together a mirror shattered in a million pieces. That's the work that you and we are doing. And so I want you to realize that when we put this mirror together, it doesn't come out perfect. It might be distorted. There might be missing pieces. We might put pieces together that are upside down, but we're putting it together. And that's the most important part of our work. And each of you, in each of our language communities, is doing that work. So I want you, when you look at that mirror and you see yourself, your families, your communities, your lands, when you see the reflection, I want you to cherish the reflection, even the cracked pieces. We are strong and resilient. I want you to know how cherishing that is. So I thought about the challenges that we face. And so one of the challenges that we face as we put bring our languages back together. We live in a world where much, much resource has been put into ensuring in this part of the world that English takes precedence over everything. We live in a world where we're habituated to live in a colonizer's language. And so to bring our languages back to everyday use, we need to be imaginative, we need to be courageous, we need to be persistent in being able to create those spaces within our families, and that's a huge challenge because of the world that we live in. To be able to speak our language, to be able to hear our languages, and to be able to hear those in our families that often are broken apart, where members of our families live far away, where we come into the habit of not visiting. One of the most beautiful parts of my family and my community when I was growing up is that people would pel elchim, we called it. Pel elchim. I know you have that word in your languages. Pel elchim in my language is to visit. To go and have a cup of tea with somebody. To go and just sit on the porch and visit. To tell stories. To reminisce. To laugh and joke. To be with one another. Had we not had that, I may not have recovered from my experience in residential school. But it's because people would come together in such an uplifting way, such a caring way, that we've been able to overcome all of those experiences. And so I want to encourage you. To bring language back, we need to pel elchim, to visit one another, to spend time with one another. And in our communities, we need to be able to do that. And I know that in some communities across this country, and they did this in Hawaii, they created opportunities and times for people to come to gather together, to eat together, and to use their language. You are creative people, and you can find many, many other ways to be able to reconstruct and reproduce those opportunities to use language. So that's one challenge. It's important to reconnect language to all areas of the community. This is key to be able to use language in ceremonies, to use language when you're having community events, to be able to share in singing and in dancing, in storytelling, and in conversation. When you greet each other on the streets, when you find each other on the streets of Vancouver and Victoria and Terrace and Prince Rupert, Nanaimo, greet each other in your language. Many of the people from our communities, from my communities, the Lillooet and St'át'imc speaking communities, are here for these. And when they arrived yesterday and met me in the hallway, it was beautiful and wonderful to be able to hear my language. And so I want to encourage you to do that as much as you can. I want you to be able to, there are many traditions that we still practice in our communities. In our communities, we still fish, we dry salmon, we prepare foods, we dig for cedar roots, for cedar bark. We still get food from the forests. Last week, my nephew came, and he brought for me what we call kaihuin. Kaihuin in my language is a man's leg. It's from a plant called hakwa. And hakwa has a female plant and a male plant. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, the male plant, when it's just in the perfect stage of growth, is tender and tasty, and that's what he brought me. So there are lots of things that we do still today. From our cultural practices, from our cultural knowledge, I want to encourage you to continue to do them, because it's the way in which we continue the relationship with the land. But it also, when we bring our language to those activities, to those ways of being, it helps us to understand and to appreciate the beautiful, beautiful ways in which we see the world. It's the way that we name the world, that we realize our uniqueness. When I began my talk, I said that I was happy that you've come together, and I used a particular word that I always teach my students. And that word is kamuhkasha. Kamuhkasha. And kamuhkasha is a very special word. It means, and I can feel it in this room, and I felt it very quickly yesterday. When people come together for a common purpose, and they spend time together. They eat together. They greet each other. They tell each other stories. What happens is very quickly there's a flow that seems to go, that moves amongst the people. That flow is energy. When you feel that flow of energy that moves through the group of people like you, like all of us here today, that is the moment in time that people know that they can get a job done. That's when they know that people can put their minds together to be able to do what might seem impossible. So that word is really, really important. And I know that there is a word like that in every one of your languages, because it is something that is important, necessary, in communities, especially I think that we're oral speaking language-based communities, because people had to be able to share with one another freely, without fear and without shame, to contribute your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience, to make sure that good decisions are made. So kamuhkata is a very special word. And because the words in our languages are usually built from a root word, I thought about, so what does that word mean? Where does it come from? And what is at its core? And where is this flow? The flow, the root, is from our belly buttons, not from our minds, not from our hearts, not from our hands, but from our belly buttons, because that reminds us of the life-giving force that is. So you can see why it's important to contemplate and to think about our languages. We can learn so much just looking inside our languages. We learn who we are. So building supportive communities is key. Another challenge, I have 10 of these, I have 13 minutes left. So learning language in institutions is our reality today. And the institutions that have been created force us to be separate, force us to be fragmented. They force us to be exclusive. And so the schooling systems that we must create must counter that. We must find ways to be able to make those changes. They're bound by time. They're controlled by time. They're controlled by standards that have been created not of our making. And so, yes, our children and we spend a lot of time in those places. But we need to be able to find the ways to be able to address the fact that they are not made with our value system of inclusion, of bringing generations together. And that was probably one of our biggest tasks, is how do we create the conditions in the places where we live, in the spaces where we live, the institutions that now are part of our world. How do we reconnect the generations? How do we reconnect all of the members of our family and community and to recreate those within the institutions in which we live? Thank you. Also, in educational institutions, the institutions of learning, most of the resources, I would say the majority of the resources that people are producing to teach the language have come from sources that have been designed for another language. They've been designed and the templates have been made from other cultural values. And I want you to work harder to producing learning resources based on your worldview. That's your challenge. In my research, not too long ago, I'm always looking, and I saw a curriculum resource developed by the Inuit that's based on their worldview. It's available online. I want you to look at it. I know that it's going to be hard for them to follow it, to reproduce it, because it clashes with so much of what exists in institutions that they have to work with. But it can be done. It must be done. There's a young boy. I was at a meeting on the west coast of Vancouver Island. At the time, he was 12 years old. And some of you have heard me tell this story because it woke me up. He got up in a meeting. There were people in that meeting, adults, leaders in the community, leaders in the school district. And he got up and he said, "I'm wanting to learn my language." But when I'm learning my language like English. That was a very powerful and awakening statement by a 12-year-old boy, and he named it. He named this challenge to us in what we must do. And so, because I only have 7 more minutes, I'm going to I want to say something about this, that one of our challenges is overcoming verbal downgrading, punishment, devaluation, silencing, fear, self-doubt, worry, and emotional trauma. Those, I'm afraid, are things that we are needing to address And I want you to very honestly, courageously look at your role, the role that you play in letting this happen. Because our speakers are dwindling, and dwindling fast. And the people that we rely on, like the young woman in the film that you just saw, she's learning, she's trying. We have young people like that across this country. And if it wasn't for them, we'd be stuck. We wouldn't be going anywhere. And so what I challenge you to do is to support those young people, to support the new language learners. I challenge you, I urge you, and I'm asking you to support the silent speakers that we have in our communities. People who know our languages, but they no longer speak. I want you to encourage them. I want you to look in your communities and to find those people who speak the language but are not engaged. Find ways to invite them in. We need their ability, we need their knowledge. And we can do that when we're kind to each other, when we're accepting of one another, and when we're not reverting to learning, to doing what we've learned to do, which is to put each other down. That happens in our communities. And I want you to be brave, to be courageous, to be able to support one another, even if we're not saying the words maybe in a perfect way. Even if we're using our language like a translation, because it is only with regenerating the habitual use of our languages in every part of our community that we'll begin to learn and speaking will become naturalized. And that's our challenge. The last thing, the last challenge that I have, and I think that this is probably one of our biggest challenges. So much of the way in which we use language, the way we speak, when we reconnect with our language, we reconnect with our identity. When you speak your language, you, I'm sure, feel more of who you are than at any other time. And when you come together in your community gatherings and you're using your language, collectively, you are who you are. So identity is key. This sense of knowing who you are, that's our language work. But what has happened to us? In order for us to be controlled, in order for us to be overcome, We've been forced to saying, it is you who belong and you don't. It is you who can stay here and you can't. It is you who can come home, but you can't. We've been forced to do that. We're at a stage where many of our people no longer live in their homelands, in their language communities. They have a right, every person who is Indigenous, who belongs to a language community, has a right to that language. And so our challenge is to being able to make that happen. And so that's the work that we need to do in the next little while. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming to this conference, gathering together, being willing to kamuhkasa, and your ability, your willingness to listen to one another, to learn from one another. And I want to thank you for letting me have this time with you. Kukstum kalep.